NATO headquarters under the Secretary General is a convening authority of 32 nations. So the decisions of NATO, I see this in the news all the time. People say, well, why isn't NATO doing something? And you can say, well, because one of 32 countries don't agree to it.
Welcome to the future of GovCon, a weekly podcast that looks at what is happening now and how it will impact the future of our industry. I'm Jake Frazer, owner and CEO of Precision Talent Solutions. In leading one of the industry's top executive search firms, I talk to influencers across the industry every day. C-suite executives, growth officers, diplomats, senior government officials, and top flag officers. Every week, we bring in experts from across GovCon, cyber, AI, space, NATO, medical, and more. And we'll have them share the key trends happening today and how our industry will look in the years to come. So pour a cup of coffee and let's get started. Hey everybody, this is Jake Frazer with Precision Talent Solutions. Welcome to our podcast, The Future of GovCon. We're thrilled to have as our guest today the esteemed Lieutenant General retired Andy Rohling. Andy's calling in from the hills just south of Vicenza, Italy. And so we're really happy to have him on today's show. Andy, thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And it is nice to be in the hills south of Vicenza. It's a beautiful day. The temperatures are cool, and I'm looking forward to a good day with you and a good day here in Italy, as always.
I thought we might try and do this face-to-face in your front yard, but I think we're going to wait and do another edition later on.
Yeah, I'll be ready for that. When everybody's done working on the house, we'll have an off-site, as they say.
Andy keeps saying, this guy keeps threatening to visit me. He must think
I'm ready.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Andy and I have run across each other over the last couple of years through ISOA, where I'm on the board, and he's been a guest speaker. And I had the pleasure of working with his predecessor at NATO, Lance Landrum, a great guy who has successfully made the transition into industry. Lance, if you're out there, shout out. He got us connected. So this is great. You know, with this podcast, what we're trying to do, if you think of government contracting as a pie, there are a lot of different slices to the pie, right? There's cyber, there's space, there's logistics, there's medical, and there's also kind of COCOM and different military agency slices to the pie. And we're trying to get experts from each of these different areas of government contracting together to give our listeners insights about, you know, what's happening from your view. I mean, you are an expert on NATO. I accept that. And if there is such a thing as someone that knows everything about NATO, you know a lot. So we're just thrilled to have your perspective. I mean, NATO has kind of gone through a rebirth and a reinvigoration here over the last few years. So your perspective is going to be great for our audience. And it's also good to get to know a cool 3-star general that rode his motorcycle from Brussels to Italy for his final PCS move.
And rode my bike from Germany to Italy as well. So it was a double way to go.
Bicycle bike?
I did rode my bicycle down. Yeah, it was awesome.
Oh my God. All right.
Yeah.
Like an e-bike or like a manual bike?
No. My fancy Italian road bike.
My God. All right. You're pretty hardcore.
Yeah, it was good.
I'll let Andy talk about himself, but just as an introduction to everybody, Andy's got a great career serving in the military, graduated from ROTC. I like ROTC guys. Nothing wrong with the West Pointers, but I like ROTC guys because they think on a different wavelength. Went to University of South Florida. He spent the last 8 years in Europe. So he was in England, Germany, Italy, Brussels, and now is resettled back in Italy and his fresh into retirement as he plans the next step of his career. Obviously, he has a lot of insight to give to industry partners about, you know, where's the money going in NATO? Where are the opportunities? So a great mind for our listeners that are looking for insights. Andy can help you understand the big picture and also some of the details. His last job, he was the deputy chair for the NATO Military Committee. I'm going to let him explain what that is when he comes around to it. But prior to that, he was also the DCG, the Deputy Commanding General for the United States Army Europe and Africa. That's a big job. He was the Commanding General for the Southeast Task Force there in Vicenza, CTAF, as a lot of us know it, they cover a lot of what's going on in Africa. And he was also the commander of the NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. which is something that's been exercised a little bit here over the past few years. So, and prior to that, just a great career as an infantry officer, right, Andy?
I am. Yeah, I'm an infantry officer, career infantry officer.
My greatest fear was getting branched infantry, because that would mean being cold and wet all the time.
That is the truth. Yeah.
The infantry guys would always come up to our tanks and ask us to turn the engines on so they could dry off.
Spend many a day behind the big heater. Yeah.
All right. Well, tell us, before we get into like NATO and all that, talk a little bit about Andy growing up. What got you kind of pointed towards the military? Talk a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So born at Fort Belvoir when my dad was still in the Army. But then, before I remember much more, we moved to Milwaukee. My dad worked for Allis-Chalmers back in the days when Allis-Chalmers was both manufactured tractors and hydroelectric generators. Those don't seem to go together, but that was their model. And my dad worked on the hydroelectric generator side. He was an electrical engineer. And then, so grew up in Milwaukee, and as I was getting ready to go to college, which I was woefully unprepared in what college equaled, I thought it was a lot like high school. You just showed up. My dad asked me, "What are you going to major in?" And I said, "What do you mean major in? What is this? I didn't understand this whole concept." And he said, "You should be an engineer." So, lo and behold, I chose, and shockingly, my dad was an electrical engineer, said I should be an engineer. So, and then he said, "Well, Allis-Chalmers had got bought out by Siemens, the German company Siemens, and they were moving to Florida." And I said, "Well, enjoy Florida. I'm going to stay in Milwaukee. Why would I ever leave Milwaukee?" If you're from Milwaukee, you would understand, the Brewers are there, the Green Bay Packers, and plenty of beer. And the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee I was already enrolled. I was going to go there. And he said, "Well, go down to this school in Florida and see if you like it." And I said, "What? Why would I go there? Love Milwaukee. I have to pay out-of-state tuition." Fast forward, I went and spent 3 days in South Florida and discovered that Clearwater Beach was only 20 minutes away. There were 7 pools on campus, and the guy to girl ratio was significantly in favor of the guys. And so I came home after 3 days and said, "Looks like I'm going to South Florida." And so my academic career was based on no knowledge of a major and beaches and beer. So that was probably not the best start, but it ended me in a good place. I graduated with a degree in engineering, and then, as you just pointed out, was an infantry officer. And so I kind of have a pretty typical infantry career.
Did you go into college knowing you're going to do ROTC, or did you just
I grew up, like I said, my father was in the Army. My uncle was in the Army. I have a fairly Army family. My next door neighbor was a World War II veteran who was quite charismatic, and I spent a lot of time with. He was a big trap and skeet and hunter and fisher, and so I spent a lot of time with kind of him. It seems odd now when you talk about growing up next to a World War II veteran, but you have to, I think, if you remember the 70s, those guys were only in about their 50s. And so it was not uncommon to have World War II and Korean War veterans. And so I knew quite a few of them, and they kind of inspired me. So I went into college knowing I was going to go into the Army, and that was my goal. So then, yeah. And then
it didn't dawn on me until graduation day. You took your gown off and put your uniform on, got sworn in. I was like, "Oh, this is happening."
Yeah, it's real. That's right. And later on, I did a few commissioning ceremonies at South Florida, one of them, and I had a conversation with all the young cadets at that time. They're hours away from getting commissioned. I said, "This is a little bit like the priest asking you before you get married. Make sure before you take this next step, you're committed." So it was nobody quite gave me that talk. I don't think I'd change my mind, but it was sometimes I think the younger guys don't understand what they're going, the freedoms they lose in some ways and the opportunities they gain.
Absolutely. Now, were you a good cadet, or were you just kind of?
I was a good cadet. I was a bad student, but I was a good cadet.
Yeah.
And, I am on the 5-year graduation plan. I'd like to say that was because I was an engineering major, but I have a feeling it was a little bit more to do with my
social activities.
The fact that Clearwater Beach was in fact only 20 minutes away.
Yeah. I'd say I was a bad cadet and a bad student, but somehow it all worked out. Yeah.
Well, same thing. It worked out for me somehow. And as you pointed out, the difference between ROTC and West Point. My daughter is a West Point graduate. And she quickly, in probably the first 3 weeks of her West Point experience, pointed out how terrible ROTC people are and how much better West Pointers are. And I was really shocked how quickly she was indoctrinated into the ways of the long gray line. It was quite humorous.
Okay, so coming out of South Florida, and you must have wanted infantry, I would guess.
I
right?
wanted infantry as my first choice, and I wanted to go to what at that time was the premier choice of. There's always in 1989 there was two choices everybody wanted. You either wanted to come to Italy, which was always hard to get to, and then the other one was 7th Infantry Division in Monterey, California. It was kind of the cool place at the time. It was a light infantry division. I mean, light infantry division. My entire company, I think our vehicles that we had was one motorcycle. That was it. That belonged to a light infantry company at the time. And it belonged to the XO, which when I became the XO, I was very happy to have my KZ 250 motorcycle as as my thing. And then I went to the so from 7th Infantry Division to 1st Ranger Battalion in Savannah. That's where I met my wife as well. She was in the Army as well as a parachutist, and so it was kind of all worked out. And
was she a career soldier or
no? She just did 3 years and then she got out.
Okay,
So
interesting.
I met her at 3:00 in the morning at the back of a C-141. Most people probably don't remember that, but the old C-141 airplanes were getting ready to go to a jump and all camouflaged up. And she was a cute girl. I walked by and we probably said terrible things that you can no longer say. And somehow it all worked out.
Mm-hmm. Lucky man. Did you make the jump?
Yeah. And we made the jump. Yeah,
all right.
I survived. Yeah. So I was really on a jump onto my first experience in Europe because I went from that jump. We were loading up and we were flying to England to do a training exercise with First Para, which didn't work, but it was a great experience to get to Europe for my first time. And it was kind of the beginning of a long career of opportunities in Europe.
When you got to Europe, was that the first time you'd been in your life, or just
first time I'd been in my life? Yeah.
And what was
it was great. I mean, we jumped in to the UK, did a couple of days of training up in Scotland, and then I think of this now as when I was a battalion commander, which I would have never probably let happen just because of the risk would never get you in trouble. They took the entire First Ranger Battalion and drove down after a couple of days of training, put us on buses, and we drove into downtown London at Trafalgar Square, and they took the entire bus, stopped, opened the door and said, be back. This was a Friday, be back by Sunday night, and opened it up and let 450 Rangers downtown in London loose. And remember, this is 1991. So no cell phones, just make sure you're home by Sunday night. And I think to myself later on as a commander, holy crap, who would underscore? I don't know if I'd underwritten that kind of risk in my day as a commander, but I was sure happy about it. And so it was really my experience. I got to wander in London for 2 days because I had nowhere else to go. We had to make my way home. So it was really enjoyable.
You get the international bug and it doesn't leave,
Yeah, exactly.
My dad was you'll know this from, he was in SINTAG. Do you remember SINTAG?
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's a long time.
In Heidelberg, at Campbell Barracks.
Yeah, so that was the beginning of my time in the UK, and we liked it. And so when I left the advanced course, my number one choice was to come to Europe as an assignment. So my first official assignment was 1994 to Germany.
Great.
As a captain. From a light infantry guy going to the 3rd Infantry Division, heavy division, and they made me the division gunnery officer, which was kind of humorous because I've never even seen a tank or a Bradley or any of the other huge amounts of mechanized equipment coming from the Ranger Battalion, and I became the division gunnery officer. So it was a bit of a learning experience quite quickly.
I bet, yeah. When in your military career did you first come in contact and start dealing with the contracted support?
Probably Iraq when I was a battalion S3 and XO.
Okay.
It was really where, most of the time before, a little bit, that's not true. When I was a captain in the Ranger Training Brigade at down in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, when I first got there, I was the S4. So I ended up doing a lot of the base operations kind of things.
Okay.
And so not contracting in the way we think of acquisition in today, but contracting in the way of, who contracts for the grass and maintenance services, who contracts for the building repair services. So it was and it was with the Air Force. So it was fairly joint activity. And it was really my first experience of contracting for services, not contracting for goods, but more contracting for services. There were some goods, but mostly services. And we found it interesting is how you understand the nuances of it and what can get you in trouble and make you successful together.
And can make you successful if you know how to use them right.
Exactly. If you can capitalize on it. And then when the war in Iraq and Afghanistan started, that's of course where, more and more so, to the point where my final, thankfully, I did not have to sign when I was the deputy commander of 10th Mountain Division, and we were in Bagram in 2016. And they said, okay, General, we need you to sign as a brigadier. They said, we need you to sign the services contract for Bagram Air Force Base. It's $1 billion with a B. And I looked at it and I said, you guys have lost your mind. First of all, I'm an infantry officer. You guys understand that, right? And you want me to sign a $1 billion services contract for Bagram Air Force Base without having any review or anything. It was just like they just walked in and, hey, sign this. And so I said, okay, I'll sign it after we do a portfolio review of every single subcontract of this $1 billion, which sent shivers down all the contracting people's spines. And we started that portfolio review. And then I got reassigned to go to be the advisor for the Corps in Helmand. And so I never got to finish it, but it was really the beginning of real contracting. I mean, $1 billion is not funny money. That's real money. And how you kind of break down those contracts and stuff like that. So from, again, a grass cutting contract to a $1 billion service contract is kind of the spread of where that went.
And you got to think, I mean, the importance of GovCon or government contracting, the integration with the military. I mean, and I think, and you could talk to this, but I think the U.S. is just, so far along in knowing how to integrate with contracted support. And I think maybe from NATO perspective, they're still trying to get their feet underneath them on how to do it in how to do what types of contracts to do, best value contracting. Like
NSPA is really NATO's contracting command that does it. They do a good job. The challenge is with NATO, and we can talk NATO as we get into it. The challenge with NATO is people, I think, sometimes forget that NATO is also an acronym, but NATO, of course, is not really a unified headquarters. It's 32 nations. And so decisions have to be made by 32, not just the NATO headquarters. There's very little that the Secretary General can do just all by himself, wake up in the morning and say, go buy 25 Eurofighters or go buy F-35. That is not in any of his remit to do so. So if NATO wants to buy something or contract something, all 32 have to agree to it. And so the analogy I sometimes use is think of yourself going to lunch with 32 of your friends, sit down at the table and say, you all got to order the same thing. One guy's a vegan, one guy is gluten-free, somebody else is this, somebody else is that. And the beauty of it is you'll argue about what you want to have for lunch until the cook comes out and says the kitchen is going to close in 5 minutes. And then you'll figure something out. So you will order something because it might not be what everybody wanted, but you're going to get something. And this is a little bit like NATO, is that you start out with a real desire. Somebody wants to have a sirloin and somebody else just wants to have a salad. And in the end, you're going to get something. And then the next battle becomes is how you split the check, but that's a different story. But anyway, that's kind of why NATO contracting can be challenges. The organization is there. NSPA is there. It's very effective. It can be hugely cost efficient for people if you can, if you work through the system. It's not super complicated, but it is more so than the way that the United States does it because we have a bit more centralized.
So let's go back to when did you first come in contact? You were a hardcore U.S. Army infantry officer. When did you first come in contact with NATO?
1994, when I was first assigned to Germany. So, when you do your DD 214, so for those who aren't U.S. military, it's that when you retire or separate from the service, the Department of Defense Form 214, it kind of lays out everything that you've ever done for the military, tells you what award you got, blah, blah, blah. One of the little lines in there says overseas service. And for me, out of 36 years and whatever days, my overseas service was 19 years, 4 months, 19 years, 6 months, and 4 days. With the exception of my 2 years in Hawaii, all of that is Europe. So, I'm not even really Hawaii. That actually doesn't count as overseas service. But either way, my first time with NATO was as a captain on the ranges at Grafenwehr, the major training area in Germany, when you had to share ranges with German units and Italian units and so forth. So since 1994, so for the last 30 years, I've been part of NATO as an organization. And then more and more, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, mostly Afghanistan, that you really worked with NATO as a bit more of an organization. to include NSPA, because my last tour in Afghanistan, NSPA is the one who did all the contracting for the base I was on.
And how would you characterize, from that perspective, how would you characterize kind of the evolution of NATO, particularly as it comes to contracting? What have you seen from your perspective?
I thought my personal experience at the user level is that NATO contracting was more flexible than U.S. contracting at the user level, i.e. if you got down in Afghanistan and you had the program manager that was working your area, you had a lot more flexibility than you did if you were working with, one of the big primes that were doing some of our base support elements. So my first part was a bit more user-friendly. When I got now then to the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, where I was the deputy for operations, and then when I was at NATO itself, I found it to be, as you kind of pointed out, it can be a little bit more confusing, and for the reasons I kind of earlier said, there's a lot of hands in the pie to get there, and it's effective, it's cost efficient. It's definitely cost efficient if countries will collectively use it for shared requirements. So if you have 3 or 4 countries that have the same requirement, the best way to contract that is through NSPA, because you get, for lack of a better word, group discount. So it's a powerful force. You just have to understand it a little bit.
Yeah, our last guest, Patrick Malcor, my old business partner, who's now in defense manufacturing, and I asked him about kind of the European view. He's like, yeah, my hope is they can cooperate and agree on some common platforms, because...
Well, now you're getting into EU business, so that's not the same as contracting. So this is the other thing that I really learned about my time in NATO, is that if you talk NATO and you want to talk contracting and you want to talk procurement, if you're not talking European Union, and so if you got to really talk a couple things: NATO, right, European Union, non-European members, and North American members, really say US. So there's really kind of, 3 big categories of that. And it depends on where those cross over to where there's challenges and opportunities in that. If you've got something that a certain country that looks a lot like France, it really wants to do, and you're trying to do that in another country, specifically non-EU country, you're going to have a challenge, because, there's very EU-centric countries that want EU manufacturing, they want euros for NATO spent in the Eurozone. So there's a continual tension that goes with that.
Right. And remember, if you're talking EU, you're not talking about United Kingdom.
You're not talking about the United States.
You're not talking Turkey. You're not talking United States, which is a lot of your defense capacity.
A lot of especially Turkey. People forget about Turkey. Turkey's got a lot of capacity and capability, and they are more often than not at odds with the EU for a number of reasons. Most of them political, but they have a lot of capability, and getting them into the Eurozone to compete for contracting is important, because they have that capacity and capability that many European countries don't.
Absolutely. So before we get our hands deep into NATO, let's go back to your career a little bit. You led the NATO. This is more operational before we get into contracting. So you led the NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps.
That was the DCOS ops. So the commander's a 3-star Brit, but I was the DCOS operation. So I was the J3 of NATO, of the ARC.
And how was that? How did that integrate with contracted support?
Well, I mean, as kind of in the same way that a S3, G3 on the U.S. side would have an operational impact on the J4 and the contracting guys at using a U.S. example. So, my role as the deputy chief of staff for operations was to develop the requirements, and then with those developed requirements, work with. In the ARC, it was very interesting because you had both a national element, so the UK element very much so, and we were a NATO, clearly a NATO core. So it was trying to balance a bit of national requirements, i.e. you've got a core headquarters based in Innsworth and in Gloucestershire that had a responsibility really to by UK, if you will, but yet they're a NATO element, so there's a NATO tied to that. And so as I worked with the DCOS support, who was a British officer. Him and I would, try to put requirements and solving those requirements in procurement together. And it was really my first taste of larger NATO contracting, is where that went. And then, in fact, the ARC was a little bit different in the fact you had a real life support battalion, as they called it, that kind of worked all that real life support. So all the care and feeding of people belonged to a unit. And so that's the DCOS ops. I just gave the task, and the battalion headquarters or the brigade commanded by a brigadier did a lot of the execution of that.
Okay. And then when you were the CG at CTAF, that was a U.S. mission, right?
Yeah, I started as the commander of CTAF, which was really, at that point when I took over, it was the commander of United States Army Africa. So the theater commander for Africa. And then halfway through, for a lot of reasons, which I agree with and still agree with, we combined the United States Army Europe with the United States Army Africa. And I had just come from being the deputy of United States Army Europe, so I knew it quite well. And that combination of Europe and Africa under one 4-star commander was beneficial many ways in the procurement and future development from a very U.S. side, and it was quite helpful.
Touching on that point, do you see that from a COCOM perspective of them combining AFRICOM and EUCOM?
That's a policy issue. Could they do it? Yes. If the desire is to reduce by a 4-star, could you get rid of a 4-star? Yes, theoretically, the EUCOM / the AFRICOM guy, if you combine those together, I think you're going to expand his ability to be a real commander. I mean, remember, he's already the SHAPE commander, so he's got a huge NATO command, EUCOM, a huge US line. And then if you threw Africa on top of there, I only think it's capable is if you put a super strong deputy 3-star, and he was the day-to-day guy basically for Africa anyway. So I'm not sure. The best you're going to do is save a little bit of overhead on a couple 4-star and support staff, but the requirement doesn't go away for Africa. So will they combine it? That's a political question. I think the gain, if your whole entire gain is to save a 4-star, it's a very small gain. And,
I think the contracting community, there are a lot of views on that. We're kind of going to segue here, but I think contracting community in some sense would like to see it because it would bundle requirements. So you'd be bigger requirements out there. So they would be more, because frankly, the stuff coming out of Africa is so small and piecemeal that the industry doesn't line a lot of resources along that because it's a bunch of small bits and pieces. So,
well, the biggest challenge of Africa, 54 countries in Africa, I think only one of them, Morocco, doesn't do foreign military, FMF and FMS. Most of the people don't buy stuff. We somehow give it to them under some variety of a State Department program. So the market, while we want to sell things to the foreign and one of the 54 countries in Africa, we don't do as much of it. Morocco really is one of the only few countries that actually goes out and procures with their own money activities. Much of the rest of African countries is not. In the end, the contractors get some money for it, but where the funding comes from is not as helpful as other countries probably. Yeah. I think your FMF is going to even go less than where we've been, which I think, unfortunately, without making any policy and political statement, we open the door for those who really want to spend some money over there, and that's China and Russia.
Yeah, it's just not the priority. Okay, so that's so the CTAF, and then it rolled into the USARAF.
Yeah, it was a good combination because, like I said, I'd been the deputy for United States Army Europe for 2 years as when I was just the United States Army Europe, and then I was the commander for United States Army Africa. And then when I left that job, I went and we've combined the headquarters. It was a kind of a natural step to go back to now be the deputy. That brought my time before as the deputy for Europe and my time as the Africa guy and bring those together. And for United States Army Europe Africa, that move to a 4-star commander, I think, is what gave U.S. Army Europe Africa a bit more power and a voice inside of the Pentagon, for sure. We're specifically in trying to get money and resources.
Right. Yeah. So then your last role there in Brussels.
Yep.
That's where we met is as the deputy chair of the NATO Military Committee. Talk a little bit about that role. What did you do?
Yeah. So I would like it. So first of all, it was interesting. The first time I'd actually been in NATO in terms of inside, behind the curtain, if you will. I'd been around NATO, like I said, for 19 years, one way or the other, and worked in and around NATO formations, NATO commands, but never in the building. And I sometimes if I could rename it, I wouldn't call it NATO headquarters, because when people think NATO headquarters, they think a little bit like SHAPE, where you have a commander, General Cavoli and now the Gronk. You have one guy who makes decisions within the authorities he's given. NATO headquarters under the Secretary General is really a convening authority of 32 nations. So the decisions of NATO, I see this in the news all the time. People say, well, why isn't NATO doing something? And you can say, well, because one of 32 countries don't agree to it. But anyway, so I would liken NATO a little bit to the Pentagon, if you will. And there's the OSD staff and the Joint Staff. So the Office of the Secretary of Defense's staff, that's the civilian side of it. And then you have the Joint Staff, which is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that's the military side of it. If you think of the NATO in that same kind of construct, where your permanent representatives, all your ambassadors and the Secretary General, are kind of the Secretary of Defense and his staff, and then the chairman of the military committee is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then I was his deputy. And so those are the same kind of constructs of, the Joint Staff gives advice to OSD. OSD makes a decision. The military committee gives advice to the political committee, which then gives it to the Secretary of NATO. So, and then my role as deputy, more often than not, was involved in the subcommittees of activities in NATO. So I was not only was I the deputy of the military committee itself, but really most of my time was spent as the co-chair of the standardization committee, the co-chair of the logistics committee. I sat on the resilience committee, and I often was part of the medical committee, on top of being the reason that the United States is always the deputy is because the nuclear mission. So there's a nuclear oversight requirement as well. So even though I'm an infantry officer and they talk nukes, it was always exciting. I was ready to nuke everybody, but nobody agreed with me, so that's okay.
So you get on these committees, right? And it's got to be frustrating, but you're seeing a very high view of, let's say, NATO logistics, right?
Yeah.
How's that planning happening, and how much are they incorporating contracted support into their planning?
Yeah, the challenge and we'll use standardizations and logistics were the two biggest committees I sat both on. They were only as powerful as the countries that put forward the right people. So unfortunately, sometimes some of the committees, the nations only would put a person on there that could say no but couldn't say yes. And so the push really, and I'm sure if you talk to Lance and his experiences, the deputy would say the same thing, is he started it and I continued on with it, is to get decision makers to come to the full committee meetings that could say yes, not just say no. And so what we tried to do at those committees was to bring contracts and bring changes to, in many ways, European Union regulations, which a lot of logistics had to do with movement and military movement and so forth. How can we bring those decisions to the committee where the people that could say yes from the nations would then allow that to move forward? And I think we're making headway. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic that it will continue to get better. That nations realize, if you go back to my point that says NATO is only strong as 32 people together. If somebody comes to the committee meeting and you've got a really good idea, but the person that's at that committee can't agree to it, then you've kind of had an interesting meeting and it was a nice dinner, but there's no decision. So I think it's moving in the right direction and people are realizing it.
That would seem to be something to really focus on, right? Because you're not going to get anywhere with no. I mean, you gotta get some yeses if we're going to move forward, because there has to be transformation in NATO. Things have to change.
Yeah, I mean, standardization was a great one. It's an enormous important thing to have, and I'm sure those in the contracting world recognize NATO standards, NATO STANAGs as they're called, and where they are. the biggest challenge we have with NATO standardization, frankly, is implementation at the country level. So a lot of people say, well, NATO, they can't make a decision on standards. Well, no. The NATO has actual standards. The problem is countries don't follow them. And so part of the push on the standardization line is to make sure when the people come to the meeting, what I don't need is the expert on the standard. What I would need is the person that can enforce compliance with standardization. And so as people are looking at contracts with NATO, my opening question would be am I providing specifically a good, not as much services, but goods that are NATO standard compliant? And if you have a product that's not NATO standard compliant, I think you have two ways around it. One is maybe NATO's not your preferred customer, or second of all is engage with the country that you're representing to get that your product into a NATO standard. And I think it's capable, it's possible. It's just a matter of good ideas that aren't spread across NATO aren't necessarily helpful for NATO.
Yeah, and that must be a heck of a process to get your product into a STANAG, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge to get your product into a STANAG, especially if you then go against, when we were talking earlier about national industrial issues. So if you're country X and you've got a great product and you want to change the standard for your product, but country Y also has a manufacturing capacity in that same product, and they've got intellectual property rights or they've got trademark rights, and you're going to get a fight in the EU, frankly, that will affect your ability to get a NATO standard. And I think people underestimate a little bit. First, are ignorant in the terms of they don't know it, and second of all, underestimate that interlinkage between the EU and NATO in contracting and in procurement.
Right. So 2025 has been a disruptive year for NATO. I mean, at least from the outside looking at it. And you've had a front row seat. You were there at the summit in June, at the NATO summit, where the alliance announced the goal to 5%, which has some subparts to it you can probably explain for everybody. You were at the Shangri-La dialogue as well, which has an even broader, more global view. So we have lots of changes going on in NATO now, this year, that are going to have implications on the future. And could you pick out a couple of the big themes that you're seeing from your perspective behind the curtain at these very, very important policy meetings?
Yeah, so 2025 was a culminating year in some ways. And so I wouldn't say it was disruptive in many ways. I would say that there's ways that I think NATO gelled in a way that I would firstly say that I don't think Russia expected. Second of all is that with the change of the U.S. administration, there was a lot of anxiety about where that was going to go. And I think that the Hague summit kind of helped quell that the United States remains supported to NATO. I mean, people continue to question that, but no matter how many times that you look at this administration has very specifically said, we continue to support NATO. You have to separate that from troop, reviews and forced posture, blah, blah, blah. But the core underlining message from this administration is we support NATO. And I think that message was received. People sometimes didn't like the way it was delivered, but the fact is that the message was received that they support NATO. And then this push, because of what has been ongoing with Russia, that we needed to increase our defense spending and defense capacity, is really the culmination. And it's kind of behind the scenes of a culmination of about 5 years worth of work. We started with the NATO 360, which was the overarching view of NATO and where NATO wanted to go. And then we gave that to the military committee, and the military committee did its military strategy. And then we gave that strategy to SHAPE, and SHAPE developed the defense and deterrence of the North Atlantic area, the DDA family of plans. We gave that then to the Forces Command at Brunson, Naples, and else, and said, okay, now develop a regional plan that goes with that. And then all the countries agreed to that. So now down to the tactical level, we have actual plans for the defense of NATO. Then we put that into the NATO planning process, the NPP, and said, if we want to do what we agreed to, this is the capacity and capability that we need to have as NATO to meet those requirements. And then this is what drew a little bit. In some ways, is it true that the administration picked 5% kind of out of thin air? Probably, I don't know. I wasn't in the room. But at least 3% or 3.5% of it is based on actual capacity and capabilities that NATO members need to procure to meet the regional and the theater level plans that they agreed to. And so for the first time in a long time, we have a real line from strategy to war plans to capability to procurement to meet that. And we have pledges that came out of The Hague that said that we would do it at 3.5 in actual buying military equipment, planes, tanks, bullets, and 1.5 in defense related activity. And I think that gives countries a little bit of a buffer zone to help spend their defense dollars in a way that also meets some of their national requirements.
Dual use.
Dual use,
Yeah.
which, the battle is going to be is what's really dual use. I mean, Italy just said that they want to make this bridge that goes from Sicily to Calabria as a defense article. Okay. I mean, that might be true. I'm not going to get into what Italy's going to not do, but I think there's opportunities there. And so I think and to be honest with you, without being a complete sycophant, I think that we have in the current Secretary General a really powerful, capable leader that understands the dynamic between NATO and the EU that has been missing a little bit, and that I think is better than it has been before, and does quite well in dealing with the non-EU and specifically the U.S. administration to kind of keep it all together. So I think we're in a good spot. I really am. I'm of course, I spent the last 2 years at NATO, but I also am quite strong on where we are.
So just breaking that down, that the 3.5 of the 5 has got to be military application. And are you suggesting there's actually a bill of materials and services that adds up to 3.5? Or
so those capability targets are what is supposed to be add to 3.5. The argument with Spain was that Spain said, well, if I add up my capacity target, it really wasn't 3.5. But okay, I don't have exactly what exact items that Spain was after, but that's the construct, is that 3.5% is the actual beans and bullets, or bullets and tanks that are needed.
Okay. For some reason, I thought it was an arbitrary number. That's heartening to hear that there's there's a real list behind that. And then the 1.5%, so the audience understands, is it's kind of, it could be
defense related. So if you want to build a pipeline to help fuel, and you can use that fuel to get from point A to point B, then good. And then you can use that. Really, it helps countries meet their 5% of GDP on defense. And so it's a little bit of, and really the goal for that was to do sustainment and resilience expenditures. Like, what do we need to do that can help us? It's not a tank, it's not a bullet, but it's part and is tied to a defense requirement.
For our space fans out there, and for Dave Gelazada, General Gelazada, who is leading the space symposium, how much of that's going to go to space to beef up the non-U.S. space capacity?
Each country, right? NATO's struggling a little bit. I wouldn't say struggling, but we're trying to, or they now, I can say nay because I'm no longer there, but NATO's trying to make sure of what is NATO's face. I mean, NATO, again, if you remember, NATO's 32 countries. It's not a real headquarters. Does NATO own a satellite? Does NATO want to own I think no. I think what they want is access to capability. They want countries to own satellites and countries to operate satellites, and they want to make sure that NATO has the capability that ties to that.
Interesting. I think there's for our industry friends out there, I think there's space and space on the NATO side.
Oh, plenty of space and space. Heck yeah. I mean, if you look right now, and I'm not in any way, I'm an infantry guy, but you look at the drivers of where space activities are. Most of it sits in the United States right now, frankly, and the European are lagging a little bit in getting some commercial space capability. There's a lot in there that they can use.
Let's say hypothetically, Andy, you had $1 billion to invest based upon where NATO will be increasing spending levels over the next few years. What kind of areas would you focus on?
I would focus on command and control architecture that is compliant across NATO. So it goes back to little standardization. Right now, NATO doesn't have the capacity. I shouldn't say they don't have the capacity. They don't have the depth of capacity to provide C2 infrastructure across the alliance at a level that most commanders are not happy with. So, and then even more so when you start getting into conversations in the nuclear range, that I think is a significant investment that needs to happen, and they should invest in that. I think that they are going to continue to invest in actual hardware, into your tanks, your big primes kind of things, and then there's emerging technology, and that right now everybody wants to talk drones and AI. Well, I agree. There's a real market for that, but it's also a market that we got to make sure people don't get too fixated on one thing of that. I mean, that is the thing that's affecting in Ukraine, is changing warfare a little bit, but there's more to it than just a drone and AI. So emerging technologies in a more broader term is probably also, and frankly, I think many countries are looking for it, and I've heard it several times. Well, don't tell me I need a Patriot battery. Tell me I need a capacity to defeat 25 incoming missiles within a given period of time. Okay. That's a whole different thing than telling me to buy a Patriot.
That's right. Yeah. Interesting. We're about to move to the future of kind of government contract as it relates to NATO. Before we do that, what's your read? What's Andy's read on what's going to happen with Ukraine?
Every war ends somehow, right? Either it ends because the one side capitulates, or somehow there's a treaty/peace deal. I don't think that, my personal view is that Ukraine's going to capitulate. So I don't think the Russians haven't been able to run over and occupy Kyiv. They tried it 3 years ago. They're not there. So I'm not sure that's what's going to be the end of Ukraine. So some kind of an agreement will have to happen. Whether that happens in the next year, 2 years, Russia has proven, even at over 1 million casualties since the beginning, that the fact that the Ukrainians are killing Russians isn't the way to win that war either. So there's got to be some variety of an agreement at some point in time. And so what that looks like, clearly nobody knows, because we just can't quite get there. But I think it can't go on forever. So,
but isn't there a sense the longer it goes on from a NATO perspective, the stronger NATO is going to get, and the more they're going to get?
Yeah, because it continues to show resolve, right? So our challenge would be is if all of a sudden tomorrow Russia pulls completely out of Ukraine and says, that was a big mistake, we really want to be peace-loving country, that some might say, oh, look, we got it all wrong. Russia really is a good country, and we shouldn't spend 5% and everything else. It's kind of what we did for the last, since 1989, and it really wasn't the good decision, because then all of a sudden you find yourselves without a capacity. So, if Russia left Ukraine completely tomorrow, I think that there's got to be continued push to maintain the capacity levels and capability levels that we desired into the future, or we'll just be sitting right back here the next time Putin, version 2 comes around.
So in a way, the longer it drags out, it's actually worse for Russia. Because it's got
worse for Russia, yeah. I mean, in terms of solidarity of NATO and a recognition of the threat. I mean, look, Sweden and Norway joined, or Sweden and Finland joined. That wouldn't have happened, before February 22.
All right, so let's go ahead 3 years, not 10 years, not 20 years, 3 years, manageable. Still, kind of the tail end of this administration. And how many NATO members are there?
I don't see a way. So, I mean, clearly the one that everybody would talk about would be Ukraine, and I think it's been pretty clear that that's a tough one to get through in the current role. I don't see, my personal view is I don't see Ukraine as a NATO member in the next 3 years. On a road to, which used to be the terminology of NATO, the absolute path to membership and blah, blah, blah. I think we might still use those words, but I don't see them. Even, frankly, I haven't heard those words lately, but I don't think that they're off the table, but they're on the sideboard at best at right now. There's no other countries that are banging on the door really to be NATO members. Partners, yes. I mean, I think we're NATO partners. We have partners in the Pacific. We have partners in other areas, and NATO partnership is good. Some worry that NATO will get involved in Asia. I have don't believe in the next 3 years you see NATO in Asia, but you can't help but know that or recognize that, North Korea is involved in the war in Ukraine. China is involved in the war in Ukraine. Iran is involved in the war in Ukraine. So for NATO not to have an interest in the Pacific and other areas, it would be foolish. But I don't think you're going to see NATO members in the terms of remembering what the articles of the NATO membership are, that you would see an Asian nation as a member of NATO, because we wouldn't extend the, Article 5 to an Asian nation. I see some conflicts in countries, politically, but I'm not so sure that they would, Brexit, per se, of NATO. I mean, some countries are tied to Russia because of energy infrastructure and their own internal politics. And sometimes they say, well, this doesn't meet my current requirements. And so we're seeing countries say, I believe in NATO. I'm not going to stop you from doing it, but I don't want to be a part of it. And we're seeing that happen today. I think we might find that might be a little more common in the future, where in order to get a resolution passed, you used to have 32 absolute yeses. I think what you're going to get in the future is, 32 nations, nobody will say no, but maybe 1, 2, or 3 will say, we just don't want a part of what you're doing.
I mean, there's certainly an implied cost of dropping out.
Yeah, I think that nobody's quite willing to drop out yet. I think some countries will be having to be continued with their internal political issues to be reminded why NATO is important.
Okay. Interesting. So, all right. So we're going forward. I already had you give us a count on NATO. Sounds like 32. I'm going to hold you to that. Any other, how do you see, we're 2028, what's going on in the world? What's going on with NATO? What's going on with the contracting support to NATO?
I think that you're going to see that by the end in the next 3 years, that this 5% GDP pledge, many countries, I think, really will, in the next 3 years, will continue to push for this pledge, that they will actually get real progress over the next few years on this, and it'll be helpful. And I think that we'll see some contracting progress, and it'll be good for us in general terms, is where I think there's a lot of opportunities. If I could put it down into whereas I think opportunities over the next 3 years to meet those spending goals and limits. I don't think anybody's going to repeal them.
Okay. And I'll give me one word that summarizes your feeling about the future of government contracting as it relates to NATO.
I gave a sneak peek a second ago. Opportunity is my one word. I think there's a real opportunity. Countries are committed to spending money. The requirement is there. It's articulated. The threat is there. We see it every day in the news. There's an opportunity for contracting and companies that want to do business, not just with NATO, but within their individual 32 member nations as well.
I'm bullish on the European defense space. Just the macro trend is there, and I just think, and I look at it from a talent perspective. They're going to need a whole new set of talent, just like the U.S. is going through a talent revolution in GovCon. Europe's going to go through a massive upheaval. They got to get a services industry built. So it's really fascinating. Andy, I tell you, I had a good time doing the call with Patrick before, but you got some great insights, fascinating stuff, factual, experience-based. And I would say to our audience, and particularly our friends that are leaders and executives in the government contracting space, I mean, Andy's a wealth of knowledge, easy to get along with, not very casual, 3-star general, I would say, rides a motorcycle, got his hair cut just for today's podcast. So, but cool guy to work with. And, we look forward to helping Andy get access to opportunities across industry through precision experts or whatever, having him at the I think you could help a lot of companies right now as they're trying to navigate this post-summit, because there's a lot of opportunities, as you said, but you got to know the big picture and you got to know the details. So,
thanks for having me, Jake. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to the future.
We may have to do it again to do an update.
I'm ready.
We may have to do it again, and I would say to our audience, thanks for joining. This is we're off to a great start on the podcast. If you're enjoying this, certainly, subscribe, share with your friends, post it. If you have any questions, you want to engage with Andy, let me know. And yeah, make sure you're following with Precision Talent Solutions. So thanks for joining me on the future of GovCon. If you enjoyed today's conversation, share it with a friend, follow the podcast, and subscribe to YouTube so you don't miss our bold predictions shaping our industry. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn and learn more about Precision Talent Solutions at pts.careers. Thanks for tuning into the future of GovCon, and see you next week.